Hi, and welcome to vblogs.com, online CBT training, online IT and virtualization articles. Feel free to check out our website for other articles and online CBT video. You will definitely not be disappointed that you did. Anyway, welcome. We're discussing Citrix XenDesktop 5.5, their newest version of their virtual desktop product line, 5.5, and we're mainly going to be touching on and focusing on the subproduct or the sub-features of XenDesktop, which is provisioning services. Current version as of 12.6.11, version 6.0. So we're going to be discussing the installation of provisioning services, but within this CBT, we're going to be focusing on really step one of the installation and setup of PVS, which is DHCP services and setup. So let's jump into it. So here is basically an overview, kind of the process flow, high-level overview of the steps needed for installing and setting up provisioning services 6.0. And that entails to first get your base infrastructure set up, which is what this video in particular is going to be focusing on, a substep of this line item being the DHCP setups. Other infrastructure includes your Active Directory environment, your DNS for proper name resolution, also making sure you have your SQL database in place, and things of that manner. Step two of the installation process is to actually install your Citrix licensing server, which we will be making a CBT video of that step and process later on. The third step is actually configuring, setting up your PVS services. Recommended at least 2 per site for high availability and load balancing. Can be either a virtual or a physical server. And then from there, once you have your core services in place, to actually create your sites, test your configuration, configure your role-based administration for proper security, and then creating your stores. So let's really dive into things here. So what this is, from a high-level overview, I just want to go over the provisioning process. What happens, what occurs. So if you follow my mouse, on the left-hand side, depicted in this diagram, are some virtual machines. Now with the provisioning services, most commonly you'll see it used with virtual machines, can be used with physical zero clients, and it's also used with servers that require a static base OS disk. So a disk or OS disk that doesn't really need to change, such as web servers. It's commonly used with the XenApp services and things of that manner. So from a high level, depicted in this diagram is actually a virtual machine. And what happens is the virtual machine does a network boot, doesn't actually have a local disk, does network boot, does a pixie boot on the network, does a broadcast out to find a DHCP server within broadcast range, communicates with the DHCP server, receives its IP settings that can communicate on the network, and then also from the DHCP server, it receives special line configuration to point to a separate TFTP server. When it receives those settings, it points and communicates with the TFTP server, and the TFTP server contains bootstrap files to point to the actual provisioning services server so that it can stream and boot to a vDisk across the network. So let's break this down a little bit. So step one, you can see here it does a VM comes up on the network. It's configured in its BIOS to first boot to the network. It does a pixie broadcast on the network. Step one, within broadcast range is the DHCP server. The DHCP server responds not only with its IP address and the VM's new network settings, but also options 66 and 67, which point the virtual machine to a TFTP server, which, as depicted here, resides and is coupled with the provisioning server, but more commonly it would be actually a separate server or system on the network. Once it points to the TFTP server contains a bootstrap file which depicts and defines the provisioning servers within your farm. Most commonly, obviously, more than one for high availability, load balancing. Then the virtual machine from that file will then point to the provisioning server across the network, where it will then obtain its virtual disk and will start streaming its virtual operating system disk across the network back locally into its memory. And from the local end of the VM, it will look as if it's actually booting to a local disk. So this whole process, all these steps are really done within a matter of seconds. From first person actually sitting at and using the VM, if we were to view the boot process on the VM, it really looks as if it's booting to a local disk because of the fact that it boots so fast and it's such an efficient product overall in performance. So, as I said, we're going to really be discussing and focusing on DHCP services setup. So, what we're going to want to do then is to actually log in to your DHCP server. In our case, it's coupled with on the domain controller or Active Directory and DNS server. Here depicted is us being logged into our domain controller, housing DHCP services. We had clicked on the start menu, went to administrative tools, and then clicked on DHCP to manage and configure DHCP on the server. Once within our DHCP services console, we then go to scope options. Hopefully you have a specific scope set up for your virtual machines. You want to make sure that a scope is in place for IP address assignments for your virtual machines booting, and that scope and that server is activated. Its DHCP services are activated on the network. Once you have that set up as depicted here, you go into scope options, which will allow you to configure the IP addresses that the booting virtual machine will receive on the network, such as what IP address it'll receive, what it'll use as its router IP, what it'll use as its DNS servers, what domain it's on, things of that matter. Here's a quick image of the actual pool. We defined in here, we used IP addresses 200 to 230 for VMs booting, doing a network boot, and the IP addresses that they will receive on the network. Now, the meat and potatoes of this setup, the actual key focus points are DHCP options 66 and 67. And we'll first discuss on option 66. What option 66 does is it points the virtual machine, after it boots up and it talks with the DHCP server, that virtual machine that does a network boot needs to know where the TFTP server is so that it can be properly pointed to the PVS server. So option 66 tells it where this TFTP server is. In this case, we're using 0.984 to boot to, so 192.168.0.84, which is the IP address of the TFTP server. And then also DHCP item 67, which says, okay, once you point to the TFTP server, what is the bootstrap file name? And by default in our setup, it's ardbp32.bin. So these are the two main line items that you need to configure for pointing your VM, which boots the DHCP server, to your proper TFTP server. Off that TFTP server, in this case, .84, that will then tell the VM where the provisioning server is so that it can boot its virtual disk across the network.